Again, we are suggesting the essential spirit. We are suggesting that the spiritual is really at the heart of all that we are and all that we do. And all that we think and all that we believe all grows out of a spirituality, out of ultimately core beliefs. But there's a lot of other beliefs that are layered on that as well. And so now we move on to the spirit, this body, mind, spirit. And it's like, why do we do that? Well, first of all, to again help us to understand this. The power of spirituality lies in the fact that it's fully embedded into the fabric of life. At times, spirituality clashes with other aspects of life. More often, though, spiritual growth and decline go hand in hand with growth and decline in other spheres of life. Facilitating greater spiritual integration can enhance the well-being of the individual, not only spiritually, but also psychologically, socially, and physically, no matter what is happening to them psychologically, socially, and physically. Which says that facilitating greater spiritual integration and connection with one's spirituality can enhance the well-being of a person with dementia. Because that spirituality still lives in that person. That has not changed. The ability to express it has changed. But even the ability to change it or reform it has not changed. Because again, the reforming of this spirituality is well beyond words. It can be very much through hugs, through relationships, through all sorts of different ways that this spirituality, this sense that God really loves me, does not take words. In fact, it's probably more powerful without words. That quote, by the way, comes from, back again, Kenneth Pargament. This is one of the spiritually integrated psychotherapy. It's in your bibliography. This is probably one of the best books, the most important books dealing with spirituality and healthcare that I've ever read. In fact, as I said, I wish I had written it. It was the book I've been trying to write, but I'm glad I didn't, because Ken did such an incredible better job than I, because he comes from some different perspectives and brought in more stuff that I was not aware of, which we're going to see now. The religious, the spiritual within us, religious is that expression of the spiritual, is elusive not because it lurks beyond the ordinary phenomenon, but because it is woven into the phenomenon. That's why spirituality is so fuzzy, because in order to attach it, in order to touch it, you got to break it apart in terms of how it's attached to all sorts of relationships and experiences and ideas, and all sorts of things are all wrapped up together. And when you pull those ideas and those things away in order to get to the spirituality, it's gone. Because it exists in that interwovenness. And it requires that interwovenness. It is that interwovenness. It is that integration, even if we have not personally reflected on that and made that integration really operative. Now, this is the slide. It's probably the most important slide you will catch from me in the last 10 years. This is again from Pargament, and again, who is a psychiatrist, researcher in spirituality and health care, and particularly mental health care, practicing psychologist. in which he is really saying, what is the psychology of spirituality? How does it work? What does it, how, he said in the book, he says, a psychiatrist or psychologist meets this person, out of the blue, comes and has an initial meeting with them, and he is supposed to, quote, diagnose them, and all this kind of stuff. And so he says, I don't come with any preconceived notions into the session, with any preconceived notions, except I have certain understandings of the human person, such as they have the power to heal themselves, they just need to have perhaps some help, and such as is a paradigm of change, how things change, so that when a person says something and expresses something, I can have in my head this paradigm, which is like a picture, something like this, that I can drop their words into, and it says, oh yeah, that's where they're at. And I have a sense of where they need to go and what they need to do. But that evoked from the patient, not from me, but my training, etc., has put me into a place and given me this paradigm. I never had that as a chaplain or as a parish pastor. I just kind of did it by the seat of my pants. Here it is. This is the most... You begin with discovery. Again, spiritual truths are never taught. They are always discovered. They are not given. They are found. They are not taught you like I'm trying to teach you now, but what I hope you get out of my words and all these many words is more of a, now I understand. Now it makes sense. It's more of a discovery than is a accumulation of knowledge. That is always true in spirituality. Always true in spirituality. I can preach all the day long that Jesus loves you, but until that becomes active within a person, I might as well talk to the wall. And there's a lot of that, by the way. So discovery begins with discovery. Once you discover, you end up saying, hey, this is kind of cool. And so you get into modes of how do I conserve that discovery? How do I make it continue to be here? Remember transfiguration? Lord, let us make 3 booths, one for you and one for Moses, one for Elijah. Let's conserve this experience. Okay? So the first thing I do is conservation. And this is a great thing, greatest things in sliced bread. In fact, I think everybody should have. I've been born again. Everybody should be born again. And so I set up structures to help conserve that. All of a sudden, see down at the bottom, threat, violation, loss. If you notice, it comes up at 2 places. In conservation, a threat often arises. A different idea challenges, or not just an idea, an experience in life doesn't make sense. I thought that if I kept my skirts clean, God would take care of me. And here I am having the stroke. I didn't sign up for this. Why did God do this to me? Right? When, again, maybe you need to begin asking, what is your body telling you about you? And all these spiritual questions instead. But anyway, I'm getting ahead. And so they sometimes that you use some of your methods of conserving your discovery, the thing that's going to help you get through this violation or threat or loss, and you use this issue or these methods of conservation that you've discovered in stage 2, or if you will, section 2, in order to cope. If that works, see it goes up the top, You go back to the arrow goes up, over, and down to back to conservation. If it doesn't work, you move on, and you get to spiritual struggle. Now, this is where the tire really meets the road. This is where I've always believed God loved me, but now. These two don't mix. It doesn't fit. And so I get into a place of spiritual struggle. Something like I mentioned I think it was you that I mentioned in terms of being the Jonas Salk thing. You know, when Jonas Salk discovered polio vaccine, I thought, as a little kid, I thought all the kids that got polio was God's will, because that was what people said in those days. How can a person take anything out of God's will? And that was really a theological challenge for me for years. In fact, possibly it still is. And so you get into that spiritual struggle of things that just don't fit. You get the thesis, use Hegelian words. This is what I think the world is like. This is what God is like. This is what God expects of me. All of a sudden, something happens that mucks all that up, doesn't work. And it says, wait a minute, what's happening here? And we basically end up with three choices. We can deny the struggle is even happening. We can go back to the old way of thinking. Or we can move on to something new. Which always, the moving on to something new, always requires for me to let go of the past before I have reached the future. Always. Scary as hell. Because I have to release my understanding, my belief, my long-held belief of the past, and have to reach out for something I don't know what it is. Scary as all get out. And that's what's happening in the spiritual struggle time. If the spiritual struggle gets so bad that a person just says, I can't do anything about it, they end up with spiritual disengagement. That's the people who drop out of church, simply speaking. You just say, God doesn't love me anymore, so nuts to it. I'm just going to move on to my life. Or you go back to the old understanding. And thus the line goes up and over and back to conservation again. Or you move on to transformational spiritual coping. A synthesis, the creation of something new, an expansion of who God is, and a recognition that my understanding of God was too short-sighted or too small for who God really is. And so I'll begin to examine or develop a different understanding of God or the higher power or what life expects of me, depending on your theological or non-theological perspective, and you will come out with something new. If it doesn't work, you end up again in spiritual disengagement. If it does work, you return to conservation of that new thought. Not of the old thought, but of the new thought, the new perspective. And then the spiritual disengagement remains isolated until maybe the person has a new discovery. Some people come back to church after 40 years. A new discovery brought you there. A new thought, new idea, new need that suddenly went, okay? So boom, I'm back here. And I bet you almost could see yourself in there somewhere in your spiritual journey. That is a description of a spiritual journey from a psychological point of view, from a human perspective. And I find that extremely powerful and extremely helpful, because it gives me, again, this paradigm that I can begin to drop in when a person's talking, and from their conversation, I can get a sense of where they are and what's happening. And I can drop it in, and that becomes a hypothesis for me to check out, because I might be wrong. But it needs to become some place for me to begin, because I also recognize that if I'm wrong, and if I reflect that idea of mine, that this is where you're at, the resident or the patient or the member of the congregation could go to you, no, that isn't what I meant. He'll tell you in so many words. In which then you start to back off and say, oh, really? Tell me more. Therefore, I don't understand. Help me understand. Until you get a sense of where they're going. So let's go through it a little bit. Beginning with discovery. The second one, back up. There. The discovery of something sacred. Pergamon talks about the sacred in life, which can be anything. You know, Donald Trump's ego and money and power is what is sacred to him. We would put it into small s, but be that as it may, he wouldn't put it into the small s. He would put it into the capital S in terms of sacred. That is the thing that drives his life. That's my ultimate concern, okay? So, the discovery of something sacred, an event, a place, a perspective, a comment, okay? In which I try to conserve it. And you can conserve it in three ways. The path of knowing, studying sacred texts, scientific study. My wife is a real seeker type person, and she reads voraciously. A member of a religious science group, church now, Church of Religious Science now. She's not a member of a Christian church. And it's not a Christian church, but within this congregation, she is definitely a Christian within that denomination, because I could tell you what her theological challenges are in terms of staying at that place. And I can also tell you the reasons why she remains in that place, and they're all spiritual, and it's helping her to pray and connect with God in a way that no Christian church ever taught her. An over-teaching of that. And it's like, okay. And also huge importance on adult education. Massive effort in adult education. Massive. But it's all on prayer. It's all on who is Jesus for you. It's all on tire meeting the road stuff. No theology. No head stuff. Anyhow, through a path of knowing, through a path of acting, rituals, virtuous deeds, whatever, and through a path of relating, either religious building or acts of loving kindness or various kinds of ways. And this is how I conserve that discovery. And so my wife, for example, that particular denomination, I'll say something that is not correct for them. They would throw stone at me. But their scriptures is more the thought of Holmes, not Oliver Holmes, Ernest Holmes. And so reading of Ernest Holmes is a thing that they all do, and a lot of. Where a person who at Hollywood Lutheran Church comes to a spiritual expression, probably reading the scriptures as we know it, would be more likely. But it isn't that Judy does not read the scriptures because she does, but she'll also read maybe the Vedas of Hinduism. And that will also be a part of her reading and a part of her conservation. Acting, rituals, meditation, whatever, relating, feeling comfortable building, and don't change the carpet. Otherwise, I am going to get mad and I'm going to leave the church. Which is why people get so mad when we alter things within a sanctuary. Because that is a part of the path of relating. This place takes on a meaning. The place as it is takes... My kids were married on that carpet. And it was orange, and it should remain orange. Okay? You could tell that would have been 1960s when you had those kinds of things. But be that as it may, okay, God? And so sometimes one's spirituality is threatened by something external or internal. And so use the spiritual coping methods that you've learned for support, perhaps for purification, for getting rid of all the other stuff, but perhaps reframing the event into something as possible, something else more positive. And if the coping is successful, you go back to conserving the old idea, the old belief. If not, you go into spiritual struggle. And the struggle can lead to personal, permanent disengagement, or maybe a new discovery or transformation, a new definition, a new experience, thesis, antithesis, synthesis of Hegel. And only then do you return. If that is successful, you still now feel connected with God, have a sense of purpose and meaning, and all of that stuff, and you feel all these spiritual things that we've been talking about. You then return to conserving that position until the next time, because there's always a next time. Because spiritual growth is always spiritual. Our spirituality and our understanding of God is always expanding. At least should be. In my experience, it is. It should be always expanding to becoming perhaps not radically different, but still different. So that my understanding of God as a confirmand at age 12 is very different than I at age 70. Or my understanding of God at age 70 is very different than my understanding of God at age 35. Because of the experiences I have had. And the using of our discoveries as to whether they work or not, to deal with the threats, the violations, and the losses. But again, Pargament comes up with this wonderful thing. How can I talk about spirituality to a person who is a non-theist? And he says, use implicit questions. If you notice those questions, just glancing down the questions, the implicit questions, none of them have the word God in it, or even assumes God. That is a way to engage the spirituality or to take the temperature of the spirituality of a person who may not be theist, may not believe in a God. The second part is explicit questions that uses appropriate God or sacred languages. And sacred languages. And what I'm talking about there is in your healthcare setting. If a person mentions the word God, I can use the word God. If a person says the word Jesus, I can use the word Jesus. In fact, I can ask them, what does Jesus mean for you in this time? If the person talks about the Bible being the Torah, I will make sure that I only refer to the 5 books of what we call the Old Testament. If the person is Christian, everything's open to me. Why? because I'm relating to that person, not imposing on that person. I'm relating to that person as they are. And that's where the importance of this implicit questions or explicit questions. If you're not sure, ask an implicit question. To whom or what have you put your hope in? That doesn't ask. But if the person is theist, you'll get God speech. You'll get God language. And okay, there you know. Then you know you can go into another category. You're getting a sense of where you are. And you're not imposing, which is so big in healthcare these days, is not to impose. But I also believe it is important to be able to engage the person on the person's terms. And so if a person doesn't use the word God, I will not. If a person doesn't use the word Jesus, I will not. But that's in healthcare. In a parish, it's somewhat different. And yet, sometimes I wonder. Okay, we move on. To be a successful spiritual caregiver, you must be willing to enter a client's pain, their struggle. It's at the point of struggle that we are working. That time where they're trying to see if their conservative ideas will work, or when they don't work and they're into spiritual struggle. Because limitation and vulnerability are the doorways to wholeness and authentic living. Theology of the cross. Limitation and vulnerability, not pain, but what the pain exposes is that I'm vulnerable. I'm limited. That's what it exposes. And by gum, I'm going to get mad at everybody rather than give in to that. Embracing life in all of its tensions. And so exploring those tensions with a person in a non-judgmental, spiritual, companioning way. Not giving our answers, but asking our questions. Causes a person to ask ultimate questions. Who am I? Why am I? What does my living mean? Has my life counted for anything? Have I loved the right things? Have I loved the right people? Is there still a future? Does the future still hold possibilities? Or is this the end? Which is important, particularly in a skilled care center. Goal of spiritual companions and existential therapy is to engage the spirit, the core, to listen rather than control or fix. And thus, Wilkie says, and this is a wonderful phrase, I want to beg you as much as I can to be patient to all that is unsolved in your heart and the hearts of your patients, and try to love the questions themselves. Do not seek answers. Do not now seek answers which cannot be given you because you will not be able to live them. You're not ready for them. The point is to live everything. So live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing, live along some distant day into the answer. That's spirituality. That is spiritual growth. That is trusting in God. That is following the Spirit. That is just not saying, this is the way it is and it has to be that way forever and ever. Amen. Even though my experience is saying something different. My understanding. And he says, live the questions, because maybe you'll go back to what you used to think, but maybe you won't. So therefore, instead of fixing it, listen to it. Instead of curing it, learn from it. Instead of giving advice, become a partner. Instead of solving now, you wait expectantly. Wait for the movement of the Spirit expectantly. Instead of testing for it, like you do in hospital, be open to it. Instead of trying to control and manage, surrender and receive. Do you have those spiritual words on the right side? Instead of encouraging action, encourage insight. Instead of focusing on the immediate, focus on the big picture. Instead of focusing on what is seen, be open to what is not seen. Instead of being logical and material, be open to that which is of the imagination, the immaterial, because that is where God speaks. It always has been throughout history. It's been at that side. God has spoken more through the the right side of the brain than the left side. Because the left side is where we think and our ego is. The other side is where intuition, our creativity are, and we're much more pliable there. So, to embrace the existential tensions in life is the primary way the soul nudges itself into attention to the spirit. Experience, limitation, and vulnerability, our humanity, forces us to decide what is important in life. Thomas More. At least it's adapted from Thomas More. It's Thomas More. It's one of the ways God nudges us to something new. Therefore, Larry Dawsey, a MD, says, and I put this in just because it's an MD. I love it. Therefore, we must resist the reflex tendency to obliterate every ounce of discomfort for those we serve. We ought to help our clients explore the role of unpleasantness in their lives. Isn't that interesting? Explore the role of unpleasantness in their lives and be patient while this process proceeds at its own pace. Now, does that give you some help, some guidance in being a spiritual companion? Relax. It's not your job. It's to fix this. It's not your job for people to feel better. There are more times when I left my therapist's office, I left it feeling worse than I did when I came. But the reason was I was being challenged to consider things I needed to consider. And I didn't want to consider them. Okay? So it's not our role to help people through their unpleasantness and to kind of eradicate and everybody feels good. It's not the role. Rather, it's the role to work with them, to be with them through the discomfort. Or the goal of an authentic life, again, this is existential psychotherapy, is to be true to one's own ideals, priorities, and values, exploring meaning, honest about one's own possibilities and limitations in the face of a deep uncertainty about the future, except the reality of death. That's not uncertain. Authentic living means living deliberately rather than by default.